This is a wild article from the Wall Street Journal. The deathonomics powering Russia's war machine. And yet, at the same time, it's really not that surprising. So this is talking about how specifically kind of poor regions in Russia, often rural regions, are being transformed economically by the high salaries that their volunteers that are going to fight in Ukraine are being paid, as well as the death benefits that are being paid out for those soldiers, that are losing their lives. So the military wage is as much as 5 times the average, specifically in their country's poorest regions, and the death payout in U.S. equivalent is $150,000. This is life-changing money, not just the death payouts, but the salaries themselves. We're seeing in these kind of rural regions, so they're talking about Tuva and Buryatia, which I'm sure I'm butchering those names. This is bank deposits since the war started. Now, red here is kind of Russia average. Salaries in general in Russia have been going up because they have been paying so much money to support the war, factory jobs, munition, things like along with that, so as well as inflation, which we're going to see. But you still see these two regions substantially higher. If you're curious where these regions are, so here's kind of the world map. Here's Mongolia above China. This is the Tuva region, and Buryatia is up in this area. And Russia's really not trying to downplay this at all. I tried to get a general understanding of kind of the fatality rates, and I got a general sense for these regions, that it's around 10% a year. So, soldiers are going off, they're losing 10% of them. They're coming back dead. And so these soldiers are not going towards, immediate death. They are signing up for military service. That doesn't necessarily mean it's always on the front lines. But Russia, these schools are hosting soldiers that they're, these local heroes. They're, giving details about the lives of fallen soldiers. Putin is talking about this kind of a new elite of people that have kind of served the country, who then kind of go into politics and kind of have a fast track into other places in the government because of their service. And it's changing these areas. This really, I'll provide a link to this in the bottom. You can go through and see kind of family after family that is talking about this. They're talking about poverty declining in Russia here, but this is a pretty terrible graph. It starts back in the 90s. The war didn't start till right here. This general shape of poverty and decline in Russia is the same shape in the entire world. A lot of people want to ignore it, but the rest of the world is doing very well in terms of getting people out of poverty, and Russia is no different. And so very often these families are talking about when they have lost a loved one, they're saying, my husband knew what he was doing, and because of his service, we were able to get an apartment. And to someone in the US or Western society, that might seem crazy, that someone's like, I effectively traded my husband for an apartment. I'm sure that wife is devastated, but at the same time, the economic goals for many of these poor kind of rural regions are something like an apartment where they have running water, reliable power, climate controlled, safe environment. This is often what they work for their life for. And somewhere here in the article, it talks about effectively a soldier who dies makes the amount of economic contribution to their community that he would have over his entire working life. And that is very substantial. Now, in terms of the other impacts that it's having on Russia's economy, these payouts are costing 8% of state expenditure, federal expenditures. It's really hard to get accurate details on what they're spending on the military, but the numbers seem to be somewhere between 30 and 40% of state expenditures are on the war in general, and 8% of it is on these payouts. This is extremely high in terms of military spending. And because of all of the spending that Russia is doing on the war, inflation has gotten really bad in Russia. So bad that interest rates are near 21%. When our inflation got to around 9%, right, our the Fed funds rate was raised to about 5%, making kind of normal interest rates around 6, 7, 8%. And they are seeing interest rates near 21%. So there's a very tough question coming in. How long will this rise in standards persist through such rampant inflation? Will all of this money effectively be swallowed up by years and years of inflation coming because of this kind of influx of cash into Russia? So this may seem crazy, these numbers, and how, effectively these families, they're certainly not celebrating the loss of their loved ones, but the amount of money that they're bringing back if they're not passing away, and then the even more extreme amount of money that they're bringing back if they do pass away, is changing these communities. I think there's two things worth talking about. The first is, let's put these in US money perspective. So the average rural salary in the US, I looked up as of like a year or two ago, is around $50,000. So if we said poor rural areas, let's say $40,000, which means 5 times that would be $200,000. If we were offering $200,000 pay to soldiers in the war of Iraq, in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and we needed more volunteers, I think we would have gotten a lot more hands up, right? That is a substantial amount of income. And then similarly, if you look at the death payout of the US military, it really hasn't changed that much since I was in it 20 years ago. It's about $500,000. SGLI life insurance, you can Google it. And that is a life-changing amount of money for a family. It certainly does not replace a husband, a brother, a son, or anything along those lines. But if spent wisely, that will dramatically change the course of your family, mother, siblings' life because of it. So I don't think this is all that wild to think about if we were in a attrition-like war like this and had to spend money in this caliber in order to get volunteers. I think we would get the same volunteers. And then the other interesting thing to talk about actually came from my assistant who helps me with the YouTube videos. She was reading the article before I did this one, and she said, it's interesting that just a month ago we made a video about how we can't pay people enough to have kids. And now we're talking about how we can pay people to effectively go die in the war in Ukraine. And it's obviously an issue of scale, right? I think even in that article we were talking about, I think it was Belarus, but effectively Russia, where they cannot pay people enough to have kids, but they can pay people, 5 times their salary and $150,000 death benefit to go fight in the war in Ukraine. And obviously, if Russia started paying couples $150,000 a piece in order to have a kid, birth rates would go up. Similarly, here in the US, if we were paying a $500,000 bounty on having a kid, birth rates would go up. So I think it unfortunately talks to what our priorities are in Western society, especially when war is involved. But, an interesting look in terms of what our governments are prioritizing in terms of spending. If you do want to watch that video about how much we pay people to have kids, then I will link it here. Stick around the channel for similar content, and I will talk to you soon.